Hi, I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And we are Unholy, two Jews on the news from Keshe Podcasts. Hi, Jonathan.
Hello there, Yonit. Difficult week since we last spoke, I feel.
Indeed, kind of a somber mood settling over Israel. We spoke, I think, last week after one terror attack in Beersheba. Since then, it has become what looks like a new wave of terror in two other cities, Hadera and Bnei Brak. And, you know, it's interesting because for my generation, really, for the Israelis who are now in their either 30s or 40s and who grew up really with the memory of mid-90s terror attacks for at least 2 years after the Oslo Accords, and then the second Intifada, obviously, between 2000 and 2005, and this feeling, these are long years, right? This is a long period of time, which you kind of feel like you're scared to go on a bus, you're scared to go in a restaurant, you're scared to even walk in the street because there's suicide bombers who can attack. And something in that trauma, and I remember we talked about this, you and I was talking about the trauma of the second Intifada, and you said to me, well, it's been 20 years. It's true, but the trauma lives in us, and it's so easy to sort of, sadly, easy to ignite that. And the way in which you suddenly see these attacks in the heart of Israel, in the heart of Israeli cities, sort of surprising, having no intelligence about them beforehand, it kind of throws you back into that feeling. And, you know, we're already parents to children. And the last thing you want is for them to have the same fear that we lived with. So that was a very long answer to the question, how are you doing? But that is basically how we're doing these days.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me because even when I was saying the thing about 20 years, I know how close below the surface it is. And I was speaking to somebody in Israeli this week who said, you know, straight away, the message came, I think, from her mum, who said, you know, you're not getting on a bus anytime soon. Like, even though, you know, these weren't directly of that kind, it's the absolute sort of instinct muscle memory which kicks in. And I remember just last week we were saying, and you asked, I think, how last week's attack had played in the international media. And I said, well, you know, not really. I mean, it hasn't got much attention. And that's because I said, I thought journalists were waiting to see if it was part of a trend that, you know, when you and I spoke last week, had just been one.
Yep. And
the kind of rather ghoulish media expectation or hesitation is, well, let's wait to see. And I was feeling that, and I don't think anybody thought it would come so quickly. The idea that in the space of just those few days, we're now talking about, as you and I speak, 3, you know, so that is, we are now dealing, as you say, with, in journalistic terms, a trend, in terror terms, a wave.
Yep.
And that, you know, is bound to trigger all those associations. And it's amazing how quick they come back.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, I kind of feel the need to quickly say, after what I kind of said in the introduction, this isn't the second Intifada, right? What we're seeing, and this is the good news, we're not seeing the Palestinian population en masse taking part in this, right? What you saw in the second Intifada was hundreds and even thousands of Palestinians ready to become suicide bombers. What you saw then was the Palestinian leadership actively promoting this. This is not the case now. The Palestinian population as a whole is not part of this terror organization. The leadership for sure isn't. But you feel what you do have now, which is more dangerous than you had then, and we talked about this last week, is the fact that everything is being photographed. There's a camera at every corner. Cell phones are available to everyone. And so the Israeli public, again, not on the evening news because everything is censored there, but yes, in social media for sure, is seeing up close the monstrosity of what it means for someone to murder someone else with a knife, what it means for a terrorist to, again, I'm not trying to be too graphic here, but to shoot someone at the closest range possible. These pictures are being distributed. And what happens with that is that Israelis are viscerally reacting, right? If you still were talking about lofty ideas about peace and, you know, things like that, Israelis were thinking, you know, you want me to make peace with these people? Like, that is an impossible thing to fathom. The other thing that is going around here, and has to do a lot with politics, because in this country, everything is politics. There's still a large chunk of the population that is saying to themselves, Netanyahu would have dealt with this better, or this wouldn't have happened under Netanyahu. Now, of course, for a fact, we went through another period called the Knives Intifada around 2015, where 47 Israelis were killed. It didn't look like this. You didn't have that fear in the middle of Israel, the heart of Israeli cities. But Netanyahu had this period. He also, and I have to say, if you look at just the raw data, right, the first decade between 2000 and 2009 till it comes to office, there are 1,150 Israelis killed in terror attacks. And the next decade, when he is in office, you have 161 Israelis killed in terror attacks. If you're looking for that question, why did Israelis keep on voting for him? That data is terribly important. Now, of course, there are a lot of things that assisted Netanyahu in that, and that is the Shin Bet on the Israeli side and the Palestinian forces fighting terror. But that is important to remember when you look at the fact that the prime minister right now has been prime minister for 9 months, and his legitimacy was from the outset in question. That is not helping him very much.
All of which makes good sense of our very special guest this week, because he is actually the one person, or one of very few people, who's ever beaten Netanyahu in an election, which he did in 1999. Yoni, why don't you introduce our guest for this week's podcast?
Ehud Barak is Israel's former prime minister, defense minister, chief of staff. He's Israel's most decorated soldier, and no one is better equipped than him to talk about this week's wave of terror, foreign ministers summit, the Iran deal, Israel's stance vis-a-vis the crisis in Ukraine. We have so much to talk about, and we're so delighted that you're here with us. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Obviously, we want to talk on what is top of the agenda here in Israel, and that is the terror attacks, 11 deaths in 1 week. Not as organized, obviously, as the second intifada that started when you were prime minister, but does it in any way seem to you that Israel might be facing a third intifada?
I cannot predict it, but it's clear that 11 people killed in 1 week as a result of terrorist attacks, some of them initiated by Israeli Arabs. However, a small minority of them, but some of them are really active in these kind of operations. It is an emergency situation which needs emergency steps, a crash program to strengthen, to show an iron fist against violence from any possible direction. I think that a small kind of team of senior ministers with senior heads of the law enforcement agencies, the police, even the Secret Service, and provisionally or temporarily even the IDF should be brought together to mobilize thousands, probably more than 5,000 of new policemen. And if it takes time to make a new police force or a new civil armed guard, if there is a need, let's use the reservist of the IDF. And there is a need to aggressively enforce through the police and the courts, probably with minimum penalties, using the old emergency laws that we inherited from the British mandate and which are still in force in Israel, and carry out whatever needed, either administrative arrests of individual or preemptive strike on sources of terror. You know, the Arab population in Israel, most of them, 99.9%, are innocent citizens looking for better education, better style of living, better future for next generation. At the same time, we have to block aggressively any kind of private revenge groups that emerge in the Israeli Jewish landscape, and vigilance, whether for genuine rage or for political reasons. And all this is just the tip of the iceberg. The essence that what we really need is action, is deeds, not just words. And Israel is strong. Israel will overcome this wave of terror the same way that we defeated the previous ones. But it will go through a certain tougher period. I hope and believe it should not develop during this Ramadan out of this kind of provocative climbing to the Temple Mount of some hyper right-winger politicians.
But if these, sorry to interrupt, if these attacks are born of sentiment and feeling, including inside Arab citizens of Israel, people who haven't spoken to other people, who are just, as it were, inspired to copy what they've seen. What help can all those security measures you've just described, increasing, the presence of IDF or police, what can they do to get inside the mind or heart of someone who grabs a kitchen knife from their own home? Surely all the full panoply of armory of the state is powerless against that kind of sentiment. And it's that sentiment that you're up against, surely.
No, the sentiment might be in the hearts or minds of individuals, but you cannot penetrate the minds. You can penetrate by clever use of intelligence, their intentions, their activity on social networks, their contact with others, and sometimes we are really surprised if it's just one individual that initiates. But there is certain deterring element, and there is certain kind of creating the preconditions for much faster response. Because in such events, it's highly important how quickly there is someone with weapon in hand who is ready to intervene and stop it before much more kind of massive disaster is caused by the individual terrorists.
You think then that Bennett's call for Israelis, everyone who has a license should carry a gun, you think that is helpful in this situation?
Yeah, in this situation, it's helpful. Of course, you should expect people not to use it just because some illusion cross their minds. But it could be helpful. And it's all temporary because I think that within a year or so, a real force could be created, and within a few days, the IDF, Secret Service, and others can be deployed in the streets and behind the intelligence kind of tools to make sure that we will know whatever could be known. So
the fact that you're talking about...
And I can just, Jonathan, I can just repeat it. I am confident that we have a tendency to look at things in a way that over-rationalize the past and get each side kind of digging deeper into its narrative, over-dramatizing the present. That's what happened to us here now, and probably even in regard to Ukraine, and underestimate the future and its development, both in terms of opportunity as well as with kind of threats. And I think that the most sober judgment is that Israel had been through such waves of violence for many times, including the bigger ones, but I hope and believe that we are not at the opening of a third intifada. And I believe that within a few months we'll put it behind us.
Let's talk about the involvement of Arab Israelis, which obviously complicates things. You were prime minister during the October riots, and then, the police lost control and 13 Arab citizens were tragically killed. Here it's a different situation. What you have is huge amounts of ammunition amassed. You have criminal elements. How do you disentangle all of this? How do you begin to fix this problem?
We have to fight terror, period. And we have the tools to fight terror, and we're basically doing it successfully. We should not let this phenomena of terror blind ourselves from the bigger picture, what's needed in regard to our conflict. The conflict with the Palestinians is a bitter one. It's already with us for 75 years. Some might say 140 years. And from day to day, it looks endless. Many people in Israel say, there is no way to protect the very existence of Israel if we at a certain point lose control of even a square inch of the Western, which is not true. You can bring together into one room all the chief of staff, all the ministers of defense, all the heads of security service, all the commanders of the military commanders of the West Bank, which are alive, and you will find that 90% of them are confident that the best security, from security point of view, it's better to be able to disengage from the Palestinian, to delineate, however painfully it is, to delineate a line within the promised land, within which we will have a majority of the settlers, all the strategic interests of Israel and basically a Jewish majority for generations to come, and to leave a place for a viable demilitarized Palestinian state besides it. And it's better from security point of view. But once you realize this, you end up with looking at the experience of others. Is it really insolvable? No, it could be
But the Israeli public isn't with you, Ehud. It isn't with you. It's not on that page.
They are not with me today, and that's part of the roles of leaders, is to lead, not to hold an inner compass and a sober judgment of reality, not just whether we're to judge the direction of the wind at a certain point. And I think that if we look at other conflicts, Germany and France, just 80 years ago or from 1870 on, they slaughtered whole generations of each other. They are working together, or the Balkans or Belfast, and you realize that even bleeding conflict can be brought to an end. And I said it when I ended Camp David in a disappointment. There was really no partner in Arafat. At that point, I said, even if it will take 5, 15, it's already 20 years, but 5, 15, or even 50 years, when the time will come to have an agreement, you will need magnifying glass to see the differences between what was already on the table in Camp David, or later on by Ehud Barak in his discussion with Abu Mazen, and what actually will be being agreed, because nothing will change. And I can promise you that it is solved. Few years later, people from both sides will look at each other's eyes and won't be able to explain why the hell it took us so many years and so many people on both sides to be buried.
I have to ask you, I mean, you're one of the handful of people who actually know and have a deep understanding of what this job requires. Does Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who is really kind of an accidental prime minister, resides over a government he himself calls an experiment, does he have what it takes, in your opinion? Or is it more, are you more honestly relieved that Netanyahu is not prime minister? Do you think he's doing objectively a good job, is what I'm trying to ask?
Yeah, my answer is fully positive. Mm-hmm. I would not dare to say it more than a year ago, before it came to the test. I was not sure that that's the case, but more and more I'm convinced that the man is a balanced, not just goodwill, but a person with a good judgment and clean from all these fireworks, manipulation, paranoia, and other elements that emotionally and psychologically wrapped Netanyahu himself and the inner circle around him. Mm-hmm. They are doing good. If you count, they immediately brought a budget. A great secret. A country could not be run rationally without having a budget for 3 years. They showed that there is nothing secret about Netanyahu being a class or on his own.
A league of his own.
On the world arena, there is the same kind of demand for the presence of Bennett. Young Bennett is hardly 50 years old on the world arena as well with Netanyahu. But the most important thing, we tend to forget. We have short memory about what happened here in the last 3 or 4 years under Netanyahu, especially the last 2 years. The man deliberately attacked the very 3 pillars upon which democracy is standing. The Israeli democracy, the Israeli court system, the Israeli law enforcement system, everything. The Israeli democracy was saved by the readiness of Bennett, Lapid, and Gantz to sit together in spite of all difference and run the country in a normal way. We have been relieved from a real and apparent danger to the very democracy. Netanyahu is not Erdogan, not Putin, but he was very close mentally to Orban in Hungary, and Kaczynski in Poland was ready to turn Israel into a nominal rather than actual democracy, just in order to save himself from a court case, which is now becoming more and more clear. He's deeply into this case.
So you mentioned Gantz and Lapid and Bennett, obviously. One of the participants in the coalition is an Islamist party. And some people have been wondering how viable that will be and for how long while the government is at war with ISIS inside Israel's own borders. No, I'm certainly not saying, I don't think anybody is saying that party and that politician is aligned with ISIS, but just the politics of that, a government fighting jihadist terror with an Islamist party inside it, will that give an opening to the right in Israel to say this government is illegitimate?
The Israeli right is the side of the political spectrum who legitimized Mansour Abbas and this Islamist party. When it was an issue of existence for Netanyahu, whether he will be able to establish a government or not, he invited the head of the Islamist political party, Mansour Abbas, to his prime ministerial residence and wrapped him with promises and flattering and whatever. He legitimized the presence of such a party in the Knesset, and it happens the same. It's the same way. I look at certain similarities, even with the ways he thought that he's fighting against the Iran turning into a threshold nuclear state, and ended up to doing exactly the opposite. So in his rhetoric, he's extremely against Islamic manipulation of Israel, but he prepared the ground to it. He asked for it. And for some reason, basically because he destroyed the trust in Israeli politics to such an extent that even when he promised heaven rather than hell to the Islamists, they did not believe him.
Yes, but that was all in theory. Now we are in practice. And the question is, if this gets worse, if there's a war in Gaza, if there's a operation in the West Bank, and there's an Islamist party that maybe will feel the pressure to have to pull out of the coalition. I mean, how does this hold
even
up together?
Even if they pull out, Yonit, I don't believe that the consequence will be that they have to pull out from Bennett and Gantz government, and Lapid, and join Netanyahu government. So basically, it's the more kind of normal party, Arab party to join would become the party of Ayman Oda and the others, the more kind of moderate Arabs. And they did not join, but they support the government in a way from the outside. So I don't see a reason for the Islamists in Israel to prefer Netanyahu over this government. And I think that the man himself, he shows a lot of tolerance, a lot of patience, and very kind of good sense of the capacity to separate his Islamist background from his caring about remove suffering and encourage support for the Arab population.
You mean Mansour Abbas, the head of the United Arab Emirates?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. He shows a lot of political skill and kind of determination to separate these two issues fully.
Can we move to what was dominating attention around the world and certainly in Israel before this wave of attacks? And I'm talking obviously about Ukraine. Is Israel wrong to be on the fence, as it were? As you know, some people call it strategic ambiguity, or to be anyway in this position where it hasn't picked a side, as it were. It's opened the door for Naftali Bennett to play mediator. So my question to you is I suppose, how real do you think that mediation effort by Naftali Bennett is? And is Israel, even if there are some benefits to that mediation effort, making a big, almost moral mistake by not being fully on the side of Ukraine as it suffers from Russian aggression?
He was involved in playing the role of a mediator, and I think that this initiative to mediate is very good. It serves him. I mentioned it earlier that it can put a different light of the legacy of Bibi as a great statesman and so on, if he can do it so easily. And it helps Israel in a way. But having said that, I think that not choosing a side is a grave mistake. Israel should belong with no hesitation to the side of the United States and the European Union, not the side of Putin, which are surrounded by Belarus, Iran, Syria, probably North Korea, with certain not full support, but at least partial support from China. In the Israeli debate there was raised a kind of security-related argument that we have this Russia very close to us in Syria. We need them to coordinate about continuing our effort against the Iranian proxy operation in Syria and the effort to provide Hezbollah with highly accurate missiles. So there is certain element in it, but it should not decide this question, because we should understand that the fact that the Russians are coordinating with us has to do more than anything else with the fact that they have interest, Russian interest. I heard several times from Putin himself in Four Eyes meetings, sometimes with someone who written for him some notes, his consideration about these two bases, marine bases he has, the Air Force base that he has, and there, as Putin described it to me, he said, we are connected to this dynasty, namely the Assad dynasty, for 40 years. First of all, the Soviet Union, now the Federation. I won't let my client experience what Mubarak had from Obama. That an alliance of 40 years collapsed within 3 days or 3 weeks of popular resentment against the leader. My client could be secure that we will be behind him. And the Russians have their own interest, that we will not end up shooting down Russian fighter jets or attacking their newest, most modern air defense systems. The results might be embarrassing for Russia. So it's their own consideration, not just ours. And when we talk about security, the United States is a sort of our security. They finance in tens of billions of dollars every decade our security infrastructure, our weapon system, our capacity to defeat any neighbor. They are providing us with diplomatic safety net, almost automatic in the Security Council. They sent in every major war in the last 50 years, they sent us a heavy, massive air kind of terrain to provide us with munitions and whatever we need in order to win. And the weapons that we were destroying in these big wars was always Russian weapons. So I don't think that we should have any hesitation. But I have to add one point, which has to do with the moral high ground. Israel should be, both politically and morally, be the first country on earth to be interested in a world order, whether it is inconceivable, unthinkable to see a certain state decide to eliminate the existence of another sovereign state, member of the UN, as part of its interest just because it can do it. We should be the first to stand against it. And more than it was Martin Luther King, probably Dante Alighieri originally, who said that the hottest place in hell should be kept for those who stood on the sideline in a moment where a moral decision was needed. No other people stands more clearly exactly at this kind of point under a need to make a decision, and we have to make it. It's not too late now. But, last remark, we have to understand what we cannot do. For example, we cannot give them Iron Dome for two reasons. We don't have enough to protect Israel. We don't have enough batteries, and for sure not enough interceptors. The American Congress, not the Russian Duma, the American Congress just approved $1 billion to establish production line for interceptors of Iron Dome in order to be able to protect Israel against Hezbollah that might be attacking when a major clash with Iran happens or for some other reason. So Ukraine, for those who did not realize, is 30 times bigger than Israel. So if we need, let's say, 20 or 25 batteries to protect, they might need 500 of them. It will be probably produced over the next generation or decade enough. So it's not relevant. We cannot do it.
Now, you have been pretty vocal in saying that the Israeli government and the U.S. administration at that has no operative plan in place to attack Iran. I think that's what we talked about last time we met in the studio when we were still talking in Hebrew. Is anyone listening to you? Do you feel that that something is shifting in that understanding in the security and defense echelon in Israel and the government?
You have to look at it into the past and into the future. About the past, I think that there is wide agreement that when we ask ourselves, how comes that we cannot demand from the American longer and stronger kind of agreement? That's basically the result of the fact that Netanyahu and Trump made a coordinated steps to enable the Iranians to move forward toward the threshold state without breaking the agreement, because they argued it's the Americans who broke it. And it is clear, I think, that out of kind of cautiousness, Bennett only hints to it. He doesn't make it a major point. But he mentioned more than once, and Gantz probably didn't mention, but Lapid mentioned it several times, that it was a grand negligence of Netanyahu and Trump not to prepare a plan B when you are launching this kind of radical step of leaving the agreement where the rest stay there and the agreement is still there, and allow the Iranians to move forward. That at least had to cause America and Israel to prepare independently a plan B, surgical, kinetic operation that can break or delay the Iranian nuclear military program by several years. And they didn't. It seems that they didn't. And I'm not sure that either the United States or Israel now has such a plan. And that makes the whole question a little bit subtle. When Israeli leaders are telling you and the public, we have the capability to act in Iran. So technically, it's an accurate sentence. If the government will order the IDF to send airplanes and attack certain installation in Iran, being the port of Bandar Abbas or some other, or even some nuclear site, the Air Force will take it and will do it. And it will cause certain damage. But to think the kind of operation that we planned a decade ago against the Iranian nuclear effort was always focused on something very concrete. If the surgical operation cannot delay the Iranian military nuclear program by, let's say, 2, 3, or 5 years, it might backfire at you. It might legitimate Iran to move in the open toward the nuclear power. They will basically say, under your umbrella, you, the Americans who pretend to have an agreement with us, your strongest ally in the Middle East, who is, according to the whole world, a nuclear power for 2 generations now, they decided to attack our peaceful, as they will call it, a nuclear event, and that threat by a nuclear power, namely Israel, is compelling us to turn nuclear, even if the whole world will protest. So it's not effective. And for sure, if you don't even have such a plan that can delay them by 2 years. So we basically, 10 years ago, said that there are 3 preconditions for considering an operation. One is that the presence of viable military surgical operation that can reach this objective of delay by 2, 3, or 4 years. Secondly, an international legitimacy for such an operation. And thirdly, what we call necessity. If you don't do it now, you might not be able to do it next year. And only these 3 elements together might justify an operation. Once there will be an agreement, there is no agreement until now, but once there will be agreement right now, it will be probably a bad agreement as a result of the grand negligence of Netanyahu and Trump. But even if it's a bad agreement, it will be effect once it is signed, and it will clearly limit our legitimacy to act against Iran, especially if we don't have a convincing plan that can delay them by years. We have to understand the whole effort to block Iran nuclear military program is a kind of contest between the longevity of this regime and the success of this plan. Because we don't have a quarrel, the world don't have a quarrel with the Iranian people. It's only with these ayatollahs. The assumption is that if the ayatollahs will fall down before Iran will turn nuclear, they will never turn nuclear. But if they will turn nuclear and will stay in power, that protects them against any possibility of someone intervening in their internal issues, and it will destroy the whole world paradigm of nuclear proliferation kind of blocking. The whole NPT regime will collapse.
So do
because
we have...
Turkey will immediately turn nuclear. I remember David Oğlu told me what choice we have. If Iran turns nuclear, Turkey will have to turn nuclear. Egypt will follow, and Saudi Arabia will come even ahead of them. And by then, the countdown to the real threat, which is not a nuclear weapon in the hands of a responsible regime, but in the hands of terrorists, might still start. The countdown toward the real threat, which is nuclear devices in the hands of terror, it might take 20 years or 10 years, I don't know, but this countdown might start. That's the real threat. What is not a threat? Israel is led to believe, by Netanyahu mainly, that we are living on the verge of an apocalypse. If Iran turn nuclear, we are at an immediate existential threat. They might drop it on our heads. That's not true. The same way the North Korea never considered dropping a bomb on South Korea or Japan or the Americans in Guam. They do it in order to protect their own survivability of the regime and in order to give them more flexibility in maneuvering in their neighborhood. The reason they don't consider to drop it, they are extremists, but they are not stupid. They don't want to get back to the Stone Age. The same applies to the Ayatollah. They are extremists. They are not stupid. They don't want to turn back into the Stone Age. It's just about protecting their survivability in power. It's about correcting something that kind of intimidate them or humiliate them, that every neighbor around has nuclear power, and somehow the great Iranian civilization, Farsian civilization, cannot have a nuclear bomb. Who is the one who? So the optimal
thing to hope for is that we manage to delay this as much as possible until there's a regime change. If I understand from you, that is basically the plan.
Yeah, that's the objective of the whole world.
Okay.
The whole world thinks in those terms. And we have to realize that if there will be an agreement, it probably won't be an agreement because of Ukraine and other kind of side effects. But if there will be an agreement, it will limit us. It probably will make the kind of plan B that we have to prepare much more complicated and delayed. And we cannot avoid under this arrangement Iran from turning into threshold state. Threshold means that they have such technologies and amount of military-grade nuclear material that you can't know and you cannot prevent them from turning nuclear at the moment they choose to do it. And you know, in the eyes of the world, nominally, even Israel is a threshold state, but everyone believes that Israel is a nuclear power. So that's very risky. So we have to think. Even a bad agreement, unfortunately, is better than no agreement at all. If we want to delay them, the agreement delays them in a certain way, but cannot block them from turning into threshold. And our leading interest is to do the opposite of what Netanyahu did with Obama, to keep very close coordination with the Americans behind closed door, to make sure that we increase the coordination of our intelligence bodies to know what happens, that we coordinate in terms of diplomacy and in terms of operational steps that might be able to taken underneath the radar, and that America will back Israeli plan B for just a worst case contingency by providing us with certain means that we cannot produce that will enable Israel to take under certain situation and independent operation. All these lead to the same direction. Coordinate with the United States. Don't embarrass them. Don't question their judgment, their will. They want the same. They are responsible for what they have to do, and they don't see a viable options through the binoculars of their American interests.
Can I ask one very last thing, just very personal to you, Ehud Barak, which is you've got brilliant analysis and views of all these things, but you're now here in London, you're on business, you're an individual now, private citizen. Do you not miss being the decision maker?
No, I was the decision maker in every possible position in Israel. So I was head of the special forces, and then head of intelligence, then head of the chief of staff, the head of the army, then prime minister, minister of defense, and on the way was minister of interior, minister of foreign affairs, and half a dozen other ministries for a very short period. So and I have a lot of curiosity about so many other fields that I had to leave behind because of the demands of mission. So I will never have a dull moment in this round, and I don't miss it. And a friend told me once, Ehud, you will be called back to action when bodies will be floating on the water of the Yarkon River. Not bodies of Arab from the West Bank or from Israeli Arab, but bodies of Jews killed by Jews. I told him, thank you very much. Don't let the bodies float and don't call me back to office. And I'm proud of what I've done. I never blamed anyone. I know the reality that I made the decisions. I've no one to blame whether it succeeded or not. And I'm not worried about what history will tell about my legacy, and for sure not worried by what present kind of militants under the influence of the great dear leader are sending to me on the Twitter.
And which you're very active on. Ehud, thank you so much for talking to us. Really, it was such a remarkable and interesting conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Well, that was, I think, a really fascinating encounter. He remains, I think he's 80 years old or in his 80th year.
He's just celebrated his 80th birthday.
80th birthday. People can see this. He doesn't look 80. He doesn't sound or act 80. He's right on it. He's incredibly sharp. I thought, some of that stuff about one day we are going to make peace here and people will think, what took us so long? That was a little bit visionary. And I think one of the criticisms of him in the Camp David period was he couldn't talk like that. He couldn't talk in a big picture visionary way that, for example, Yitzhak Rabin had done and lead his nation to peace. So I thought that was very, welcome to hear him in that mode. But I do think you'll tell me, but it felt like he was making some news there with some of what he was talking about, a new force being required to deal with this current wave. Yep. Talking about Iran, his assessment of where Iran is. There was quite a lot of news in there.
Yeah, the fact that he talked about Israel being right now in a state of emergency. He has always been a harsh critic of Netanyahu, never a fan, even though he used to be his defense minister, as we all remember. But, saying that Netanyahu was a danger to Israeli democracy. What he said about Israel needing to have a much more clear voice on the Ukrainian story was incredibly interesting. And what he said about Iran was, news to me in the sense that he said basically, first of all, he talked about Iran already as a threshold state, but also saying we need to just be in this and delay as much as possible, delay the nuclear program as much as possible until there's a regime change. These are really interesting things. And he is really one of the smartest people around. His last attempt at Israeli politics didn't work out so well, but he's still incredibly sharp analyst, as you say, of what is going on.
So the things I thought were, because it's Israeli politics, the fact that he's 80 does not rule out a comeback, which it would in anywhere else.
Hey, it doesn't in the United States either, as we kind of seem to discover these days.
That is right. I mean, late 70s is the threshold, so 80s is the new 70s when it comes to Israel. On Netanyahu, I find the relationship between the two of them fascinating.
Remember, Barak, one of them, he was
Barak was Netanyahu's commanding officer.
Mm-hmm.
There we are, we're saying at the same time. So there's that dynamic. And as you said, their roles reversed because Barak served as his defense minister under Netanyahu. And they were the two who were really wrestling with that decision about whether to take action on Iran. The reporting at the time said that Barak was with Bibi on being bellicose and kinetic, to use the word he used. And yet in the end, the military chiefs and others were very
because no one else was on board. Yes.
No, which is an amazing idea, again, that the prime minister and defense minister is not enough in Israel. You have to have other people with you to make it viable. I find their relationship endlessly intriguing. The praise he gave to Naftali Bennett, I think your skeptical ear found that to be just another way of dissing Netanyahu. To me, it was interesting, the 80-year-old praising the 50-year-old and somebody from the left traditionally praising someone from the right. I thought that was arresting too. So, as always, Ehud Barak is worth listening to. He's been a man at the centre, as he told us. He's been sort of a decision maker for decades. And so really interesting to hear him speak about all that, including the stuff about Ukraine. And he was talking about Naftali Bennett's shuttle diplomacy. Can you give us an update on where we're at with that?
Well, first of all, look, I mean, we opened our conversation, Jonathan, with talking about the terror wave in Israel. What is important to understand is that this is now the focus of Naftali Bennett, and it has to be. He needs to, what he tried to be, right, this kind of the optics of the global leader shuttling between Zelensky and Putin. He can't do that anymore. Like, it's not that anyone declared that the Israeli mediating efforts are over, but they are effectively over because now he has to appear like a leader that the only thing he cares about is dealing with this terror wave. And by the way, the sad thing is, besides the tragedy of what is going on, this has actually been a diplomatic great week for Israel, right? Israel managed to bring into the desert, right, into Sde Boker, the house of Ben Gurion, the first Israeli prime minister, to bring in even he as a visionary, I don't know if could have imagined 4 foreign ministers from Arab states, plus the American the American Secretary of State, and obviously Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, to a summit that was supposed to be the focus of this week, of discussing regional cooperation, of Iran, issues like that. Of course, that is not the case because the old Middle East had to rear its ugly head, unfortunately, this week.
It's slightly that Godfather 3 line comes back again. Every time I think I'm out, it pulls me back in. And this really, I agree, the optics of that. It was one of those split screen weeks where there was the footage of the summit in the Negev and then instantly giving way to the very familiar optics of the aftermath of a terror attack. So it's quite true. There isn't that optimism. I hadn't realized that point about the focus. It's so interesting because what had been a plus for Naftali Bennett to be seen getting on and off flights in Moscow and elsewhere, suddenly he has to be on the ground in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem. Otherwise, he'll be judged, and he will be judged entirely by how this government handles it all. Our normal business does continue. I have a chutzpah award to hand out. I have a funny feeling she may be a previous winner.
Yes, she was.
Which is a little bit, like those sort of like Jodie Foster at the Academy Awards, getting Best Actress twice. We doff our cap to the Fox News host Lara Logan, who appeared on a show actually on a different program, different channel, something with the QAnon supporting show online, andweknow.com. is the name of this sort of fringe broadcast, which tells you lots, actually, about the mindset. Apparently, they support QAnon. Let's share with people what Lara Logan said online.
Darwin. I mean, when I found out, does anyone know who employed Darwin, where Darwinism comes from?
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, look it up. The Rothschilds.
Yeah.
It goes right back to 10 Downing Street.
All the way.
And the same people who employed Darwin And that's when Darwin, wrote his theory of evolution and so on and so on. And I'm not saying that none of that is true.
Right.
I'm just saying Darwin was hired by someone to come up with a theory.
I mean, you've got to almost admire the creativity of this because, there was once that guy, I think, in DC on a DC TV channel who blamed bad weather, snow, on the Rothschilds. And we've, of course, had Marjorie Taylor Greene blaming, the Jewish space laser for the wild fires in California. This to me came from nowhere.
We're lucky we have the Gazpacho police to deal with.
Oh yeah,
the
to
Jewish
step
space
in.
laser. Then
The Gazpacho can go in and deal with that. But this, I mean, going back to the 19th century and who employed Darwin, it was the Rothschilds. I mean, this, as I say, there's almost something sort of floridly creative about going back there.
See, you're being English and polite. It's just, I mean, there's something so crazy about being able to connect Jews to everything. It's just
to everything, and it's people who only ever think about Jews one way or another. There was a bit more of that. Well, in fact, anyway, I can go on about that. So yes, Lara Logan, worthy winner of Chutzpah of the Week award for her suggestion that evolution itself may be down to the House of Rothschilds and the Jews. We laugh because what's the alternative?
Exactly. What can we do? It's what we do, right?
It's what we do. So another one.
So if we were just following the trend here on Unholy, we would say that obviously Chutzpah of the Week goes to Will Smith for reminding us what toxic masculinity looks like. We talked about this a lot in the conversation with Scott Galloway, especially since he took all the focus and this ceremony that was so important for women in Hollywood. And if we're doing mensch, again, as a cliche, then we would give it to Lady Gaga and the way she held herself with Liza Minnelli on stage. But we tried to be a little bit original in our thinking, just a little bit, stay in the Oscar realm. And I decided to, or you decided to, one of us, to give the award, Mensch Award, to the best host of the Oscars ever. I think we can agree on this. Billy Crystal. I mean,
I'm with you on this.
No offense to Bob Hope, who did it more times than even more times than Billy Crystal. Billy Crystal hosted the Oscars 9 times. And I think that he just did it in a perfect way of being funny, being a little bit rude occasionally. Never into the area that Chris Rock would walk in, tread in, but just a perfect Oscar host. What can we say about him?
This is my ninth time hosting the Oscars. So tonight, just call me Warhorse. We're here at the beautiful Chapter 11 Theater to celebrate a Hollywood tradition that not only creates memories for the ages, but also breeds resentments that last a lifetime.
I agree completely. It's a nostalgist's argument, this, but all that. The funny thing was, all this Will Smith thing and Chris Rock did make me think, well, this didn't happen back when Billy Crystal was presenting the Oscars. Then I read this piece in the New York Times by Ross Douthat, the conservative columnist there, who's very, very good. And he wrote a whole piece about how the movies don't count the way they used to. And he said, what can be done? This was written before the Oscars, before the Will Smith thing happened. And he said, there's always people saying, how can we revive the movies and Hollywood? And somebody at the back will always say, bring back Billy Crystal to host the Oscars. And as I read it, I thought, but that was exactly what I was thinking. So I'm now that person who is, predicted and predictable by a New York Times columnist, because that's exactly what I thought when I saw all this row. I thought, bring back Billy Crystal. He was the business. So instead of getting the nod from the Academy, he does get a Mensch of the Week.
Exactly. We're okay with bringing back Katharine Hepburn too, as well, but that would be a little bit more difficult. So
that would be harder. But yeah, for now, we would have Billy Crystal do it every year. Why not? 9 was too few. And we would say every time we're having what he's having. So that would be our choice. If you have enjoyed this edition of Unholy, please do rate or review or tell your friends about it and get them listening. I think lots of you are doing that, so that's very good. We also encourage your emails to unholy@keshet-tv.com. Please do send us your love and affection and questions and thoughts to that email address. Yonit, who do we want to thank?
We want to thank Rom Atik and Omer Primat and Irad Eshel. And we were, I don't know, a little bit too much in agreement this week. I'm kind of worried about us. Maybe one of us is coming down with something. I think we'll go back to arguing next week.
Well, we can do that. I mean, you've been channeling your inner Friedland. My inner Levi has been channeled too. So yeah, maybe something's happening here.
No, maybe that's not a good thing. Let's just revert to what we used to be.
We'll work on it. See you next week.
See ya.